Welcome to the first part of our IVDR webinar series, a practical guide to a lab-developed test for genetic testing. My name is Lorenz, and together with my colleagues, I will guide you through the webinar today. We are very happy that there's so much interest and there's so many listeners from all around the world, from 16 EU countries and throughout all Europe, from the US to India and South Korea. So that's a very great success and shows the interest to the topic. Also, we have listeners from Switzerland and Great Britain, where the regulations will be a little bit different to the EU regulation. Today, I realized that coincidentally, today, exactly 5 years ago, on June 23rd, there was the referendum for the UK to leave the EU with all the consequences that we see now. Nevertheless, this broad attendance proves the relevance for this topic to laboratories and stakeholders in the genetic testing environment all over Europe. The last year of the 5-year transition phase has started 1 month ago on May 26. However, concepts are scarce and implementation is mostly insufficient. Hence, we would like to give you an overview on the IVDR, on how the IVDR regulates lab-developed tests. We will go into details of where these regulations are rooted in to better understand them and also allow the correct interpretation. Finally, we show you one concept about a possible way to regulatory compliance for lab-developed tests under the IVDR. Platomics is being joined and supported by 2 very distinguished speakers who have a very long history in the medical device industry. Each partner will take around 50 minutes for the presentations. This leaves us enough time for the discussion and to address your questions. The first speaker about how the IVDR regulates lab-developed tests is Dr. Sebastian Grömminger from the renowned Institut. The Institut exists to help manufacturers develop safe products and bring them into the market despite the complex regulations. The second distinguished speaker is Dr. Karina Hellbert from the medical device specialist law firm Polak Partner. She will talk about the legal interpretation with focus on Article 5 of the IVDR. Polak Partner advises medical device manufacturers on many areas, most relevant here for this webinar: CE conformity, regulatory issues, product liability, competition, trade law, and data protection. Platomics closes the round with Andreas Oberleitner. He is the regulatory head at Platomics. He will talk about documentation and processes to set up a lab-developed test. Andreas Oberleitner is assisted by Dr. Beyers, head of our clinical operations department here at Platomics. Dr. Beyers will outline the practical aspects of setting up an LTD in your lab. Platomics is a team of over 60 experts in software development, bioinformatics, regulations, and clinical applications. We support laboratories in the upcoming challenges of digitalization, automation, analysis of sequencing data, and this is, of course, the main topic here, the main story here today, the regulatory compliance. Surely there will be many questions. Please address them with the Q&A function in Zoom. Please do not use the chat function, as the chat will not be recorded after the webinar. And we could not come back to you to answer your questions in case they could not be answered already during the webinar. Participants can, of course, also contact us directly. The contact details are shown in the last slide. The better and in more detail you ask your questions, the more profound we can answer them. Requests have increased a lot lately, but we do our best to come back to you as soon as possible. Also, the webinar is being recorded, as you know, and it will be available for you on our homepage in a short while. So, without further ado, I would like to give the word to Sebastian Grömminger to talk about how the IVDR regulates lab-developed tests.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. So it's my pleasure to tell you a few details about how the IVDR regulates lab developed tests. So we could surely talk for hours and hours about the topic. I tried to put that into 15 minutes. So let us go ahead. I am a molecular biologist with a genetics background. I have 7 years of quality management experience with ISO 13485 and did a lot of software development in my former history in a medical device manufacturer company, an IVD manufacturer, as well as a medical laboratory. So I have seen both worlds. Yeah, and since July 2017, exactly in the year as when the IVDR was set into force, I changed to consulting role, into a consultant role at the Institut. And since then, I am responsible for setting up the in vitro diagnostic consulting with, in the meantime, a team of 7 experts. And we are talking today about IVDR. However, we need to see the whole picture. You may all know that Medical Device Directive and Active Implantable Medical Device Directive are fused within the European Union into the medical device regulation. It should have been, the date of application should have been last year, but due to the COVID-19 pandemic, it was postponed to this year. And since roughly 1 month, it is applied to manufacturers and citizens and companies. But the difference is for in vitro diagnostics, we do have an own directive in place and in force since 1998, and this is going to be fully replaced by an own regulation, which is the in vitro diagnostic medical device regulation, and this is to be applied for manufacturers, citizens, and companies in at the 26th of May next year. So it's roughly 1 year to go, and we are focusing on IVD since lab developed tests are fully fall under the scope of the IVDR and of the definition of an IVD. So there is a reason for that change. This is due to the fact that the world has changed since 1998. So there's a lot of genetic testing going on, a lot of new therapy options, diagnostic options. The topic companion diagnostic is very prominent nowadays, including personalized medicine. And for sure, one of the most important topics is bioinformatics, which is used in genetics all over, and respective software that implements algorithms or machine learning models that are developed. So the scope software is a very important topic, and this is exactly what you see within the new definition of an in vitro diagnostic medical device in the IVDR. It's now stated that every in vitro diagnostic medical device is itself a medical device, which is a reagent, product, calibrator, control material, kit, instrument, apparatus, piece of equipment, and now as well software or system, whether used alone or in combination, intended by the manufacturer to be used in vitro for the examination of specimen. It must be human specimen that have a purpose, a medical purpose. One of those following medical purposes concerning either a physiological or pathological process or state, concerning a congenital, physical, or mental impairment, concerning the predisposition of a medical condition or disease, to determine the safety and compatibility of potential recipients, and to predict treatment response or reactions, or to define or monitoring therapeutic measures. So you see indicated in red, these were the additions from IVD directive to IVDR, and this is, so to say, the scope enlargement of the IVDR. To say that in fewer words or easier words, we can state that IVDs are medical devices. So they are a subgroup of the total medical devices, special medical devices, so to say, which gain medical information obtained from human specimen. This is very much true as well for software. With that new definition. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, how do I know if my test is an IVD? And this is very much dependent on your phrased intended purpose. And the intended purpose is crucial to decide on whether it is an IVD, whether it falls under the definition of a medical device and an IVD medical device, yes or no. For the classification of the product, it is the very much basis. It is necessary to analyze inherent risks associated with the product, and yeah, it is necessary to meet the regulatory requirements. If you don't have a phrased intended purpose, you will not be compliant with IVDR. And just one remark, because we're talking about laboratories today and the laboratory developed tests, this is something laboratories should be aware of already under the scope of the ISO 15189 quality management for medical laboratories. The laboratory must select examination methods that are validated for their intended purpose. So if you have a validated test procedure, there should be a stated intended use as well. And so intended use includes the intended purposes, is what I will describe in the next slide. After that one here, the intended purpose is defined by different inputs, so to say. You may describe your intended purpose with your instructions for use, with your marketing material, with your statements on the website, with information on your label links, and additional information that you provide to the public and to the users. This is all input and should be in line with your phrased intended purpose that is part of your technical documentation or your laboratory developed test documentation. So it's necessary to know that the intended purpose is part of the intended use, but the intended use is not only the medical indication, it is as well additional scenarios like transport scenarios. Service and maintenance are very frequent intended uses, additional use scenarios that are necessary for the medical device to perform accordingly and be compliant, to stay compliant within the market. So it is necessary that you describe a document which we usually call intended use. And this document should contain the medical intended purpose, the patient population. It should describe the use scenarios, so which means the intended use in total, and the user specifications. So the next question we need to raise is, what are the relevant IVD use scenarios for laboratories? And there are two different scenarios. So an in vitro diagnostic examination can be either the use of CE IVD devices from the manufacturer in a regular way, compared to the use of an IVD procedure of a developed in-house procedure. So we have a medical laboratory that is maybe ISO 15189 accredited or is compliant with ISO 15189, or national solutions like in Germany, the Relebeck, which is a guidance document of the German Association of Physicists. In the regular way, we would have a ISO 3485 compliant manufacturer, which does the development and production and provides an IVD to the laboratory. And if the patient comes to the physician consults the patient and provides the option to take a sample that is sent to the laboratory examines it, sends back a report, and consults the patient what to do next. In the in-house development scenario, we have some parts of the tasks that are usually performed by a manufacturer within the laboratory itself. So the laboratory is still accredited or compliant. However, the laboratory develops and produces parts of the products that are used in the in vitro diagnostic examination itself. And in this case, we may have a manufacturer of a kit that is for research use only, or is not CE marked, so to say, not CE IVD marked. So the product does not fulfill the requirements. And the laboratory takes care that the in vitro diagnostic examination is compliant. And you see that the scenario for the patient and for the physician doesn't change at all. So they may not even see the difference. And this is these are the scenarios, or exactly the in-house developed scenario is the scenario that the EU wanted to regulate to a certain extent. And this is why we're talking about this topic today. And we need to understand what is the definition of a manufacturer. And in the IVDR, we have this definition number 23. Manufacturer means a natural or legal person who manufactures or fully refurbishes a device or has a device designed, manufactured or fully refurbished, and markets that device under its name or trademark. That's difficult to interpret for laboratories because they are providing a service. But this is what Karina Hellbert will discuss later in her talk. So what are examples of laboratory developed tests? An in-house developed, so to say, homebrew test would fall under this. The use of research use only labeled products in an in vitro diagnostic examination. The combination of different products and processes could be a laboratory developed test. The misuse of a CE IVD, so to use it outside of the intended purpose or against the instructions for use. Any modification of a CE IVD product or software algorithms that are configured in a laboratory information system would fall on the laboratory developed test as well. So the manufacturers, so that the laboratories that are using such lab-developed tests in vitro diagnostic procedures must comply with Annex 1 of the IVDR, so the general safety and performance requirements, and the following 9 additional requirements, which are they prohibit to transfer the products to other legal entities. That means you're not allowed to share the products that you're using with other medical laboratories. There is a proper quality management system required that covers manufacturing. So ISO 15189 would not be sufficient. For this purpose, you need to fulfill at least a few chapters of ISO 13485 as well. And the laboratory must comply with ISO 15189 or needs to take into account national accreditation solutions. And the laboratory must demonstrate that it is superior against the competitor CE IVD product on the market for the specific patient population. And they need to provide information and justification to authorities regarding manufacturing, modification, and use. Additionally, they need to publish the name and address and the identification of the products and declare somehow the conformity to Annex 1. So that's pretty similar to a declaration of conformity for manufacturers. They need to provide an extensive documentation of manufacturing design, performance, and compliance to Annex 1 for Class D products. But you see there is an opening claim that member states may apply this provision to Class A, B, or C devices in accordance with the rules set out in Annex 8. So there is the need of classification as well for lab developed tests to see whether you need to fulfill this requirement as well. And some member states already decided that this is additionally true for the other classes. then products are manufactured in accordance with these documents referred to in G. That means a change management must be in place and somehow a post-market surveillance, as they are obliged to collect experience gained from clinical use and apply corrective actions. These are those 9 criteria. So then the next thing we need to ask is, what if software is involved in testing? You may know that medical device software that is driving or influencing another device falls into the same class as the device itself. This an example for it would be an ELISA reader or PCR cycler that is a class A CE IVD in the medical laboratory. And if there is a remote software for run planning, plate layout, start, stop, anything that, so to say, influences the results of the IVD medical device, would then fall into the same class. It is connected via cable or via wireless connection, that doesn't matter. If the reader is class A, this software would be as well class A, but it should it must not have a medical purpose on its own. And this is the difference to the next scenario I will show on the next slide. Anyways, there could be, in addition, a liquid handling robot involved, and then it's dependent whether the manufacturer of this robot states that it is a medical device class A. If this is the case, then an according software that is influencing the liquid handling robot would as well be class A. If it is not a medical device, then the software would as well not be a medical device. If it is an independent medical device software, which is frequently used in the case of sequencing. So we have the genomic sequencer that may be a CE IVD class A product. If you're using a bio-IT pipeline, or that is, I would say in all the cases, true, this pipeline is certainly the independent medical device software, and there may be a reporting software involved, and as well the liquid handling robot. So we will certainly find the IVD medical device on the server where the bio-IT pipeline runs. And it is very much depending whether the reporting software has a medical intended purpose as well, like calculating a risk score, or is it just using the calculated score to communicate this information onto a report? Then it would not be an IVD medical device. Yeah, if that was, so to say, my summary of lab developed test requirements. If you need help, then Jona Institute is a potential partner for you regarding services, consultation, and education. So thank you for your attention, and yeah, I would like to forward to the next speaker.
Okay, Sebastian, thank you very much for your outstanding insight into the topic. We understand that it's a lot of information, and that probably not all the regulations and the rules and guidances make sense now. So we think it is very important that we also go into the legal details where these regulations come from, where they're rooted in, to better understand how to interpret them and to better know how to react towards them. So I would like to give the word to Dr. Hellbert from Polak Partner.
Welcome also from my side to the seminar. I will skip the introduction about myself because Martin was already so kind to introduce me. We are talking now about the legal requirements. I know laboratories and legal requirements are not always, let's say, fit together, but under the IVDR, we have somehow to fit the both regulations and the both considerations and the different considerations together. Lab development tests, legal framework, and pitfalls. We have both, and we have seen both. First of all, when we are talking about Article 5, lab tests and home brew, we have to identify which institutions are allowed to operate on a home brew basis, let's say it like this. These are health institutions. Not every institution who considers itself as a health institution would fall under the definition of health institutions according to the IVDR. Because the health institution, the primary purpose, and the focus is on primary, must relate to the care, treatment of patients or promotion of public health. Excluded is definitely, which you can see from the explanatory preambles, institutions only pursuing health interests, like if you go in the evening to the gym to get rid of the thoughts and you would like to have a clear head, or to spas, everything related which are only focusing on health interests. And now you can ask yourself, are you a health institution or are you not a health institution? And the IVDR will not really guide you through this topic because there is nothing in the preamble or in the parliamentary materials or in the commission documents what means primary purpose. Is it 51%, 75%, 99%? This will be up to the national courts to decide what is a primary purpose. And with respect to university labs, if you're not operating a hospital or you're not part of, let's say it like this, in certain member states, the universities do not own their own hospitals, but they cooperate with a hospital. For university perspective, is the primary purpose the education, research of education of students, research, get third fundings, make basic research, or is it the care or treatment of patients? And this is a question that you really have to answer on your own, which not is easy to answer, because if you go into the Austrian University Act, then you will see that the medical universities, the primary purpose is indeed the education and the research, and for fulfilling education research, they should cooperate with hospitals. Now, the next one, if I decided, or the hospital decided, or the lab decided, of course, we are a health institution, we have to be compliant with standard EN ISO 15189, or as it's stated, applicable national provisions regarding accreditation. And here we have to go a little bit into the parliamentary materials, respectively in the COM document of the Commission, where it proposed for the first time to introduce the regulation. And the original proposal was in Article 4, paragraph 5, and read it, and manufactured and used only within a single health institution, provided manufacture and use occurs solely under the health institution's single quality management system, and the health institution is compliant with standard EN ISO 5189 and any other equivalent recognized standard. This was challenged by the European Parliament and by the various committees because it was too fluffy, that's to say. It means compliant with, that it has to be accredited according to the standard, or simply compliant. So, because some of the labs, when you go on their websites, you see we are compliant with the ISO standard, we fulfill the ISO standard, we are accredited, so you have various versions on the website. And the opinion of the Committee on the Internal Market and Consumer Protection really wanted to focus it down and to narrow it down to laboratories which are indeed accredited, which would be an easy proof, because then you have the accreditation and you can show to the national authorities how high, or to your contractual partners, we have the accreditation. The member states were not really happy with that because not all of the labs within the member states were accredited according to this ISO standard. So it was a compromise, which was then be found and read The laboratory of the health institution is compliant with standard EN ISO 15189. So it's only compliant, not accredited, or where applicable, national provisions, including national provisions regarding accreditation. This means if the member states foresee that you must be accredited, then you have to be accredited according to the standard to make a home brew according to the IVDR. If the member states do not foresee a certain accreditation standard, then you have to be compliant. Now, when a physician or an institution does not make this kind of genetic testing and transfers it out or to another laboratory to make it, they have now to ensure, when these provisions come into actual force, that a contractual partner is compliant with the standard, because from the moment on, the IVDR actually enters also with respect to Article 5 into force. The care you owe vis-a-vis the patient is that of state-of-the-art testing. And state-of-the-art testing means then compliance with EN ISO 15189. And if you source it out, or if you give it to another partner, you still have to ensure, or you have to prove, or you have to audit whether the outsourced lab complies with the standard. Accreditation would be easy. If you have a partner and he simply says accreditation, you have it, I show it to you, I prove it to you, then you're out for legal purposes. If they only say, oh, we are compliant, but no accredited, you have to go on and find out on your own, more or less, whether it is really a compliant laboratory. Not transferred to another legal entity. That was the compromise, because at the beginning, it was like single health institution under the health institution's single quality management. But what is a single health institution? This is a legal term lawyers don't really like, because if it is not nicely defined, you have already an uncertainty. So we ended up with the compromise non-transferred to another legal entity. Another legal entity could be, according to the member states, different. Because what is a legal entity is defined by the national laws of the member states, and it's not defined at the European Union level. So you have to go into your own either corporate law, trade law, etc., to define what would be another legal entity. So we have the lab of a holding company, of a holding hospital, and for liability issues, you normally try to separate the liability between the various hospitals. So you make hospital A a own legal entity. In Germany, Austria, you would be a GmbH, or in the Netherlands, a BV or a LLC. And then, of course, Hospital B, who doesn't really want to be liable for the faults of Hospital A, is also established according as a GmbH. But this means that Hospital A is their own legal entity, even if they're within the framework of a hospital holding. Hospital B would be a own legal entity. Hospital C, if it is only a branch office, then the lab of the holding company could easily use the IVDs and ship it to Hospital C, because it has not their own legal entity, is not an own legal entity. So also here, you have to go back to your own national law to decide whether the party you're cooperating with or you're making it is their own legal entity. If it is their own legal entity, you cannot transport or transfer ownership of the IVD to this other legal entity, or not. So, which makes a little bit complicated when you're in the lab and you have to decide, oh, is this their own legal entity or not their own legal entity? And here we are coming to a product liability issue. Why are we talking here about product liability, and why are we referring to another field of law, namely the pharmaceutical and the product liability field? because the scenario is the same. If the scenario is the same, the courts use the case law already established in other related areas via analogy to decide whether the same principles would be applicable into and for the labs falling under the IVDR. And Sebastian was so kind to provide you with the definition of a manufacturer. And here it is stated manufactured and being marketed. You have to be aware that the definition of manufacturing and placing it on the market depends on the regulation or on the directive you fall under. So this means that the Product Liability Directive operates the term put into circulation, which normally is manufacturing, and putting it on the market. But put into circulation, this specific field means that by simply preparing the IVD in your own laboratory and you use it only for your own patients, this would be put into circulation under the Product Liability Directive, and the hospital is liable under the Product Liability Directive for the national product liability laws. And you think, oh, perhaps because we are financed by the public and we have no commercial purpose, we are a charitable organization, this doesn't count. The European Court of Justice simply stated, if you prepare a solution, in this case it was a solution for storage of an organ for further being transplanted, it simply says, by simply producing this solution and using it on your own patients, even if charitable or not, you are considered as a manufacturer under the Product Liability Directive, and therefore the hospital was liable. So also, even if you do not transfer it to another legal entity, there are some legal consequences based on the product liability if you are operating on a home brew basis. Are not manufactured on an industrial scale. This was also a little bit of a compromise, because in the original proposal by the European Commission, this was not considered and also not taken into account. You will not find any reference. Where comes it? Are not manufactured on an industrial scale. The Human Use Directive, the directive covering the marketing authorization for medicinal products, requires a marketing authorization if the product is, among others, produced on an industrial scale basis. So what the Parliament wanted to avoid, that with the homebrew scenario, the laboratory scenario, that you're only producing it for your own patients, that you produce it on an industrial scale, so that you abuse from a legal perspective, and simply from a legal perspective, the exemption that you can do it without needing the CE certification. So that this was the reason why industrial scale was introduced, so that the exception provides an exemption. So it should be only used really used on certain specific narrow defined circumstances. And industrial scale means serial production, significant quantity of a standardized product sold to third parties or stocked in significant quantities. Products for research use only. If you rely on this kind of product, the IVDR, when it really starts to operate, you're not entitled to any longer do it. It is simply already decided for medical devices if the product is really intended not for medical purposes. It does not fall under the medical device regulation in the IVDR regulation in this case. But if you use it, the risk benefit for such a product is always negative, because you never have tested it. From a liability perspective, this is the highest risk you can have, because you are using a product being intended for another purpose in an off-label scenario without being covered by the regulations. From a regular perspective, you are definitely not compliant. So, and then we have the information requirements. The next slide, please. Here we are also facing a little bit of uncertainty because there are no guidance at the moment available what precise information you have to give. It is envisaged that the MEDEV guidance will be provided if they are ever drafted, what kind of information must be inside. But the MEDEV guidelines from a legal law perspective are simply soft law. The national courts could rely on it, but they must not rely on it. So it gives you a guidance, and if you are in troubles with the administrative authorities, you can simply say, we follow the MEDEV, but the national authorities also could simply say, that's not enough, we have stricter rules. So guidance, yes, but still simply following it without thinking whether this is suitable under national law, that could be a problem. And now the last slide, please. Risk involved. Product liability we was discussing already, and the product liability is a liability without fault. So you could have done everything properly, you could have done, but you have simply overlooked one thing, and the home brew was not according to what it should be. It doesn't matter. Liability without fault means you will be liable whether you complied with the highest standard. If something happened, product liability will kick in. Administrative liability, then we're going back to the classification. If you don't know under which class your product falls, which rules you have to follow, the administrative fines could be rather high. In Austria, it will be depending whether the draft enters into force or is accepted by the parliament. For a first violation, 25,000 euros. And for the second, third, each time 50,000 euros. Contractual liability, never forget, even as a laboratory, the hospital has a treatment contract with the patient. And from the moment on the IVDR enters into force, the compliance with the ISO standard is part of this contract. Criminal liability, there are some certain offenses under national law, which means if you do not properly inform the patient what kind of procedure you're taking, there could be, one could face criminal liability. And commercial liability, again, competitors which produce the product on a commercial scale, on an industrial scale, consider that your IVD is an equivalent one, then they can sue you because you're not compliant with the IVDR, and that means a breach of the law, and this would be open up commercial liability of the hospitals. So the last slide, any questions will be answered afterwards.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Hellbert, for your very detailed elaboration about the legal status. I would like to give the word right away to Andreas Oberleitner. We are very late in time already. I hope some of the attendees can push their lunch a little bit back, because I think we will be maybe a little bit over our time, but let's start right away.
So thank you very much for the introduction. I promise to be short on my presentation. I will be accompanied by a colleague, Karl. He is already online, and he will continue after my talk. As we have already heard, so from the previous speakers, the IVDR explicitly regulates LDTs. The Article 5 describes the specific requirements. We have seen that before. And now reading the corresponding text, this may sound like a little bit of a major exception at first, because only the general safety and performance requirements have to be fulfilled. But there is always a second side, because this annex describes the general safety and performance requirements, as we have heard before. And those GSPRs, in short, they are very, very relevant regarding the requirements on the product. So on a closer inspection, it becomes very clear that these GSPRs can quickly become very, very extensive. And further still, these requirements are basically not different from those of a typical IVD manufacturer under the IVDR. So the GSPRs focus on the device properties, but they require also some procedures, as we have heard before, and the quality management system within the health institution as well. Example given is the risk management. So just jump over those animations. We have to consider the product requirements, but maybe also some process requirements within that aspect. So what does that mean for documentation now? We have determined that the GSPRs need to be met, but for the verification, thus the documentation, we have to consider that the IVDR requires the healthcare facility to prepare a declaration, as mentioned before by Sebastian. So this declaration should confirm that the applicable requirements for the GSPRs have been met. Furthermore, we have to give some reasons to which requirements we are not meeting them and the justification for that. This declaration, by the way, must be made publicly available. That means that anyone can view that declaration, and therefore such a document, of course, is kind of an official statement by the institution, has a certain legal relevance. So in that context, I would only sign such a document when I have the proof behind it. That means some kind of documentation regarding the evidence of the Annex 1. And typically, to fulfill those requirements, you apply applicable certain standards, for example, the harmonized standards that are not yet available for the IVDR, but hopefully soon. So that means with regards to the documentation requirements, there is another part in this Article 5 under 5G that goes a little bit more into detail about the documentation requirements. Here it is specified, so initially for IVDR Class D devices, as you can see, that the scope and the level of detail of the documentation should be or should enable an understanding of the product and also the manufacturing processes. This means that the documentation is not only intended for internal use within the healthcare institution, but must also be comprehensible to external parties, like in that case, competent authorities, for example. That means that specifically the documentation must include aspects regarding the design, for example, architecture of a software, composition of reagents, a detailed description of the intended purpose. That's very crucial. We heard it before. The documentation of the manufacturing facility, for example, the infrastructure aspects, machine aspects, but also things like main competencies or responsibilities within the facility, a description on the manufacturing processes, including quality assurance methods that you apply within the manufacturing process itself, the performance characteristics of your LDT, of course, and as already mentioned, the fulfillment of these Annex 1 requirements. So moreover, it also implies that the healthcare facility must classify their LDT or develop device according to their IVDR, because some requirements relate to the class of the device. Genetic tests for human diagnostic purposes, by the way, usually fall within IVDR Class C. So now, of course, one could think that the just considered paragraph 5.5G only concerns Class D devices. That's and is therefore not applicable to a genetic test as a Class C device. This is correct in principle, but as we have heard before from Dr. Hellbert, we have to pay attention because the IVDR has this opening sentence that allows the member states to apply these regulations to other classes as well. So look in the respective national law is always necessary anyway, but in connection with this point, we have to find out how the relevant member state deals with the extension to the other classes, for example. So I don't want to go too much into detail. I just show you some examples. Please note that all those examples are based on the drafts of the laws, so they might change in future, but as we can already see, many member states will use this opportunity to extend the requirements to other classes. So then let's have a look into the IVDR Annex 1. Just a quick look. This rather extensive annex is divided into 3 rough blocks. It deals with general requirements, it deals with requirements regarding performance, design and manufacture of the product, and last but not least, the requirements on the information. So in the first block, those general requirements are divided into central aspects, such as the definition of the intended purpose, aspects of safety, effectiveness, and also devotes a very important role to the risk management. On the right-hand side here, you can see some examples of documents that should be created maybe as a part of such an LDT file as a proof of compliance with the respective requirements. For example, a relevant verification report on certain aspects. It depends on the product itself, or for example, a risk management file. In the second block, I don't want to go too much into detail here, but here you can see there are many topics covered. This block focuses on the product itself and also the manufacturing processes. Examples could be chemical properties of your reagents, or maybe also in particular software such as the analysis pipeline, which must meet the requirements within the framework. That means a state-of-the-art software lifecycle according to ICC 62304, for example.
Andreas, I think we will later on anyway publish most of the slides on our webpage. So let's maybe go through the details quick that we can find.
Yes.
Maybe take a few questions.
I will jump over the last slide, and my last slide actually is just let me show if this works. Is information slides on the 3 different parts on components, processes, and technical documentation that you have to consider. That means that we have to document this technical documentation. Parts, by the way, can be called an LDT file, for example, and this is what the regulation probably would consider in the connection of the in-house manufacturing. I am happy to hand over to my colleague who has some more information from the point of view of the lab perspective. Thank you for your attention.
It's a pleasure to follow on from all the experts we've heard of from this morning. So I just want to briefly, I know we've got a lot of laboratory partners on the call, summarize for you what I think are probably your major concerns. I know it is also a lot of information that's been communicated to you, and of course we'll have the webinar available online, and if you want to go back, and I'll just highlight for you where I think it is very important that you sort of take note of what are those first few things that you would need to do to achieve compliance. We will have 4 major concerns for laboratories, and hence why we have the 3 experts here today. Platomics have prepared for many years to meet the regulations and to address concerns for laboratories under the IVDR. And the first one is definitely a knowledge gap. Our customers often ask us, what is it that I actually need to know? There's just so much information out there. And the key things that Sebastian has highlighted for us today is to formulate that strong understanding and define for yourself an intended purpose for your test. And this is a whole range of information that Sebastian has given us. And I know that you're is expert at substantiating what you need to know, and they'll definitely consult with you on answering those questions, because it can range from an intended purpose all the way through to post-market activities. And that may be just too much for a lab to deal with, which is why I think Sebastian is the right person to contact to answer those questions. Additionally, you may need a whole set of, well, you will need a whole set of technical documentation, and that could be a substantial amount of work. And there's definitely guidance out there available from the IONA. They do a great set of templates that you can complete. So reach out to us and we can definitely support you with that. I just want to again thank Sebastian for his very detailed explanation. Of course, this is a new regulation, and with it, Karina explained to us there's a substantial amount of risk, and the lab will no longer be able to sidestep that. It is challenging for us as laboratory individuals. We don't really have to deal with laws as such. And that is why we've asked Karina here today. I think it's very important that you review her slides again and see what are those legal risks that you would have to shoulder the burden for the moment the regulation comes into effect. Again, Karina, we very much appreciate having a legal expert on the call today. It's very insightful because we so rarely have the opportunity. I want to just summarize for you what I think are the significant things that the labs will have to deal with. And of course, with any new regulation, there comes significant administrative costs and a large amount of workload. And this is going to consume a lot of laboratory resource. You will need to do extensive validation, verification, document generation. And this can be something that I would personally find quite stressful if I were running a laboratory today. Many of our customers under these uncertain times come to us and say, what about the devices I have in my lab already? I mean, I have software, I know it works, I have kits and reagents and they function and we do use them day in and day out for clinical purposes. How can we carry on using those when we know that they are effective? So I want to briefly talk to you about how Platomics can help you solve those problems. So if we can have the next slide, please, Martin.
Yes.
So what we will do is the major focus in a genetic test workflow, the two major data sources that will be devices are definitely going to be the software and the kit. And there may be other IVDs that come into effect, but those are going to be the big ones that you have to do your performance evaluation around. So we've heard from Andreas that major IVD devices constitutes a genetic test and software being the central player because it's this sort of end solution, the final step in the genetic test. And a lot of the burden will fall on the software because of the issuing of clinical reports in genetic testing is done by the bulk of software work. So the first step we suggest is that we can offer for you this compliant analysis solution. We know that we will bring to market a Class CE IVD device for our software, and that even in a lab developed text context can take away a lot of the uncertainty and even risk that software packages have today. It also really hits the mark because we know that software hasn't always been in the forefront. Well, it certainly wasn't part of the IVDD. So Platomics are very happy to take on and offer that as a solution. Very importantly is the second step, and that's test design. Test design comes to the forefront under the IVD because you have to consider so many additional things. What is going to be the intended use of my test? You have to specify the full workflow. What kind of class device will the test be? And then, of course, all of these national laws and regulations that you need to consider. And Platomics have developed a software solution that helps you define and design the test. So that we take all of that input and give for you all of the requirement documents that you need to develop a compliant test. Like I said, a kit for genetic testing is most definitely going to be an IVD. And we know that labs require flexibility when it comes to kits. You need to be able to update the kit scope regularly. And in our experience, we've worked often with Twist Biosciences, and their custom kits really have offered reliable and rapid results. And in our experience with their white glove service, for example, we see how quickly we can get a new kit to market so that we can deliver rapid results in a laboratory. Rapid kit delivery is going to be necessary when you have the kit, when you've designed a test and you've got the kit, you need to have all of that in the laboratory so you can start validation and testing. And this is something that Platomics can help you with and coordinate. Because once the kit is delivered to the laboratory, we can send you a set of plans and standard operating procedures and a validation strategy, how to get your test compliant. Of course, our analysis and validation tools can do all of the heavy lifting for you in the terms of software analysis. And once you've provided to us some of those initial data points from the use of the kit, we can return for you a full data set that you can use for performance evaluation. And performance evaluation, of course, is essential to be able to meet compliance for the IVD. After that, those are the steps you need, and you will be able to generate a compliant lab developed test. You will have software, you will have kit, you will have all the plans and documents in place, and that is the solution that Platomics offers. Of course, once you have a compliant test, it's simple. You can run that test in your laboratory. You do not need a notified body to authorize or to certify it, and you can generate clinical data and hand that data over to clinicians for use. And you can be certain that everything that has been generated is compliant and highly reliable. What happens though if you have this lab developed test and another competitor generates a product that is equivalent? Of course, the regulation states that you may no longer use your in-house test, that you need to go and buy this CE IVD device, independent of what it may cost. The cost is not a factor. You will just have to go in and use the CE device. Of course, with the Platomics solution, we've helped you to generate all of the appropriate documentation. We've taken you through the appropriate validation process. And the next step is something that we can certainly, with the Jonas collaboration, support you with. And that is to take this lab developed test all the way through to get a CE IVD mark on it for you. And as a laboratory, that may be very interesting because then you could even sell it in the market. So new marketing opportunities are certainly possible. Then that is what I hope to explain to you how this, I mean, it's one solution. We certainly have many options and we're quite flexible. And I think today from all of our speakers, we've sort of tried to answer these major concerns. The first concern being this knowledge gap. And I think that's what Sebastian has demonstrated. The knowledge of the Jona is there and available to you. And you can certainly, with Platomics and the Jona, tap into that knowledge base. And we can answer many questions. We can provide expert opinions, consultation services, and even a set of technical document drafts. We've heard from Karina that she is available to answer these legal questions on a consultancy basis if necessary. I know many labs may not run into issues if they follow the regulation, but that's why you may need a legal expert in the future. And we would definitely know that Karina would be there and available for you. And then lastly is what I think Platomics would like to offer. We've shown you how we can mitigate this administrative burden and the amount of work that you would need to do once the regulation comes into force by using our software and kit partner solutions. And then finally, for those laboratories that have existing solutions, existing reagents in place, we would very much like to support you. Our software architecture, for example, can easily accommodate an existing bioinformatics pipeline and bring it up to standard. And additionally, with our validation procedures and understanding of kits, we can help you to bring those reagents and kits to LDT compliant or even IVD compliance. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time. I will hand back over to Martin.
Thank you very much for your very detailed and comprehensive summary of what Platomics is doing in collaboration with the Jona Institute and with Polak Partner. I see that we are already over time. You have a lot of questions addressed in the Q&A section. Don't be alarmed, we will answer all of them. Most of the viewers are still hanging on with us in the presentation, even though we are over time already. I would like to answer just a few questions that have popped up many times. The first one is, and there have been many about this, what about plastics? Do we need a CE mark for plastics? Do they need to be a part of the complete solution? And another question that states the robotics, the sequences, the reagents, what about those things? Do they need a CE mark? Maybe Sebastian, I can forward the question to you and Andreas maybe?
Sure. So with plastics, you certainly mean respective consumables like microheater plates, pipette tips, etc. These products are products for general laboratory use, which do not necessarily have an IVD medical device intended purpose. So they do not fall under the IVD definition as such, and therefore they do not need to be an IVD medical device. And it's even not possible to qualify them under IVDR if they don't have specific characteristics that make them particularly suitable for a specific in vitro examination. That is, so to say, the crucial point here. An example would be if plates are coated with a specific epitope that enables cancer cells to be isolated for a downstream in vitro diagnostic analysis. In such a case, it would would have an IVD medical purpose, and then it would fall under maybe class A, but in this case it would be more specific towards cancer. It would even fall under class C. That would be my suggestion.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Maybe a legal question which popped up 3 times. How likely is it that the IVDR will be postponed, just as the GDPR it says here, but I think the person means the MDR, which was postponed for 1 year. So are there any indications that also the IVDR will be postponed? Dr. Hellbert, could you please answer on that question?
Not that I heard.
Not that you heard. Okay, no indications.
Currently no indications, but of course, if you have a 4th, 5th or COVID-19 wave, then it could be, but if it is getting not as strong or not as severe as we had the last 1.5 years, there is no intention to postpone it.
Okay, and maybe a follow-up question to that that came up. What if nobody manages to be compliant until 2022?
That's the thing we had with the GDPR, that's the thing we're the same here with the MDR. The courts and the inspections are saying something like you have to be compliant. It doesn't matter how you achieve it. You will normally get in the first stage a gentle reminder by the authorities that you have to be compliant within a certain period. And if they're coming a second time and then you're not compliant, then you face the administrative fines. It will then simply depend on the height of the fine you will get, because it is really technical or some really issues that you cannot be properly compliant, but at least you have to prove that you try to achieve it. And if you don't try to achieve it, then you have, from an administrative law perspective, simply not fulfilled your legal requirements.
Karina, may I have a practical question on that? In the case I will not find a notified body, or the notified body clearly says I am not available, and I ask other accredited notified bodies and always get the answer, we do not have resources. So isn't that a hand and egg problem?
No, you
and
can
would that
apply
be
for
sufficient?
emergency application. The law foresees in certain member states that in case of certain circumstances that you can apply really for emergency marketing authorization, we would say in the medicinal product, but there is something like a escape clause that you can rely upon.
Thank you.
So not being compliant could be a strategy, but a very, very risky one. Also a comment from Platomics, we see that there will be some reagent providers who will manage to be ready on time and will replace this in-house products or non-compliant products. And the same is true also for large labs who are working with very large investments to get their entire portfolio certified. And this is, of course, to many small and medium-sized labs, a problem or could even be a potential threat. I have another question there from, if you claim your in-house test performs better than the commercial one, who decides whether it is true? Is the burden of proof on you? Dr. Hellbert or Sebastian, could you answer that, please?
The judge will decide. Every claim you make, more or less, that will be on for trade issue. If you have to claim it and you claim it, the competitor simply says in the brief going to the court, based on our understanding, it is not better for the following reasons, A, B, C, and D, and it must be only reasons that were comprehensible somehow to the judge. And then you have to make the counter arguments, and then you have to convince the judge that your product is indeed better than the competing product. And then it's up to the judge. Either you convince him or the court-appointed expert, or you will lose the case.
I can add what you can do practically. It is really necessary that you do make an objective research. So if you research the literature, it should be clearly traceable how you did that, and that it can be redone. And so therefore you need to have a process in place that describes how you're doing it, and please keep the records while you're doing it, and then redo it later on to capture the latest data as well.
And please not only the positive ones. You have
Exactly.
to make a fair balance, because this would also be considered cheating. That's something like when you go to the influencers and they only make the positive comments on the internet about a certain product. You have to make a fair balance, and you must always have to mind the judge will take a court-appointed expert to judge on it, and this person you must convince.
Okay, thank you very much. There are many follow-up questions on that too, but I think we're quite over time already. I'm very thankful to all the listeners who are still in the line with us. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the speakers, Dr. Hellbert, to Dr. Sebastian Grömminger, and with Platomics, Karl Beyers, and also Andreas Oberleitner. We will shortly announce a follow-up seminar about CE certification of genetic tests, and we will certainly come back to you as soon as possible with the answers to the questions that you have in our Q&A section. So with that, I want to thank you again, and I wish you a nice remaining day. Thank you very much.